Welcome to Windows on the World. The title of tonight's show is Pharoahs, Elite Crowd Control. And we're going to be referring to a book by Wallace Budge, which was written in 1901, called Egyptian Magic. And it goes into the Book of the Dead and the customs and rituals and the rules which were imposed in ancient Egypt. Now, the Pharaohs of Kemet, which is the name for Egypt, which meant the Black Land on the side of the Nile, were an unsophisticated and dynastic control system, ruled and ruling by superstition. The need for ritual was part of their system. Now, we did a show called Ritual and Religion, where we discussed the difference between actual real belief and rituals and imposed dogma, and you can find that in our Perfected Minefield series. But these pharaoh kings were idolized and presented as god kings. But what were they really? In reality, it appears they were front puppets for an elite crowd control system. Ritual means compliance, created fear in the population, and makes the population indulge in activities which take up their time and energy. Their lives were pretty controlled if you look at what was happening during the reign of the pharaohs. Everyone was superstitious, everybody was in fear, and there was a lot of mistrust. Again, just a crowd control system. But when one reads about this cult, it becomes obvious that whoever was in control of these pharaohs knew about managing population and keeping control. The revelation that these front puppets were not in charge is actually a very important one. The Isis, Osiris, Horus trinity and its variations on stories which are symbolic but simple are just a handbook of compliance to serve the pharaohs. The concept being that subservience to natural forces is presented through symbolism and deities, just a form of paganism. So basically, the pharaohs actually kept control through fear and the rituals leading to belief in even controlling the weather and life events and, of course, the afterlife. The reason we know so much about the pharaohs is because of their obsession with death. The public can marvel at statues and the alien-looking pharaohs, but the one thing they left behind was death, not life. Death masks and mummification, ostentatious and unnecessary tokens fill museums, and what we do not get is great philosophy, wisdom or knowledge. Those that created the death paraphernalia were indeed skilled, but the cult was based on superstition, and it seems to be about a complete misunderstanding of how nature and the concept of God actually works. The cult was about self-glorification, and no insight into a natural order whatsoever was on show. One of the later dynastic pharaoh kings was Nektubus, 358 BC. His works were translated into Arabic and Syriac and actually many other languages. He was famous as a magician and a sage, skilled in reading the stars, leading people, and was gifted using omens and telling fortunes and making predictions. The use of amulets, objects imbued with intention, and scarab beetles and wax figures to control or curse people is just low black magic, but of course it's still practiced today. There was nothing advanced or clever about the pharaohs. They put on these shows for the people. They appeared to have supernatural powers. Of course they didn't. It was the priesthood behind the pharaohs who were actually in control. The offerings still carried on after death, of course. Food had to be left out in the tombs of the deceased. There was so much fear around all of this that the still living person would be scared that decent food and clean water would not be left out after they died. The answer to this was that models of food were made. Little pieces of food that were symbolic were left around and placed upon an altar. And if this was not possible, images would be painted on the tomb of food that they could have in the afterlife. Alternatively, a prayer that they would continue to be fed was inscribed on the funeral furniture. The deceased needed all sorts of junk after their death, of course, including boats to take them through the afterlife. Well, the Egyptian Book of the Dead reveals the complex, overlong and unnecessary rituals imposed by the controllers. So in the afterlife, it was an article of faith among all classes that unless the participant was properly fed, they would be driven to wander about and pick up filth or anything else which was found in their path. The concept of leaving the body and becoming infinite and free of all earthly needs was not a good control system. So of course, this use of superstition and fear and magic was used against the people. In another chapter of Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, in which the deceased says, "That which is an abomination unto me, let me not eat it," goes on to say that if you are prepared and go through these rituals before you die and you get people to look after you when you're dead, then everything may be okay. But you still have to watch out because there are so many things that could come across your path. Even in the afterlife, black magic still existed. You had to be looked after even in the afterlife and make sure your meals were all sorted out in advance. Well, it kept the relatives very busy in the tombs. But even the rich were not certain that the appointed offerings of meat and drink could or would be made in the tomb in perpetuity. What then was the poor man to do to save his car from the ignominy of eating filth and drinking dirty water, says Wallace Budge? Well, to get out of this, the model of an altar in stone was made, and models of cakes, vases of water, fruit and meat, etc. were placed upon it. In cases where this was not possible, figures of the offerings were sculptured upon the stone itself. In others, where even the expense of an altar could not be borne by the relatives of the dead, an altar with offerings painted upon it was placed in the tomb. Sometimes neither altar nor model nor picture of an altar was placed in the tomb, and the prayer was inscribed upon some article of funeral furniture. And as the dynasties went on, it just got down to painting this stuff on the wall. But of course, when it all started, it meant that the relatives would have to literally feed you after you died. About 1,000 years later, when the religious texts which formed the Book of the Dead were written upon papyri instead of coffins, a large number of illustrations were added to them. To many of these, special importance was attached, and the following, says Wallace Budge, are worthy of note. In the 15th chapter of the Book of the Dead, it contains the so-called negative confession, which is recited in the Hall of Marty. A number of names and gods and beings must be learnt about, and recitations must be made. At the end of the chapter, we find the following statement: "This chapter shall be said by the deceased after he hath been cleansed and purified, and when he is arrayed in apparel and is shod with white leather sandals, and his eyes have been painted with antimony, and his body hath been anointed with anti-unguent, and when he hath made offerings of oxen and birds and incense and cakes and ale and garden herbs, and behold, thou shalt paint a picture of what shall happen in the car of Marty upon a new tile moulded, of course, from earth, upon which neither a pig nor any other animal has before trodden. And if thou writest upon it this chapter, then the deceased shall flourish, and his children shall flourish, and his name shall never fall into oblivion, and bread and cakes and sweetmeats and wine and meat shall be given unto him at the altar of the great God, and he shall not be turned back at any door in the underworld, and he shall be brought in along with the kings of the north and the south, and she shall be in the following of Osiris always and forever." This is an excellent example of the far-reaching effects of a picture accompanied by the proper use of words. And the proper use of words meant the proper use of the power of those words. And every picture in the Book of the Dead was dedicated to producing a certain result. That result being always connected with the welfare of the dead. not the living, of course. So the Egyptian Book of the Dead was a strict rule book for the afterlife and had to be adhered to by everybody. What sort of cult would do this, even wanting to control the dead by getting them in fear and operating under mental slavery? Well, we have to look at who was actually behind the Pharaohs. The Pharaohs were, of course, the equivalent of media personalities today. The chapter 11 of the Book of the Dead was written to prevent the body of a man going mouldy in the underworld and to deliver him from those who might be in that predicament. It was ordered to be recited over 3 pictures. One was of a serpent with legs, having a disc and 2 horns upon his head, the eye of Horus. And it also says, there shall be a figure with the face of the goddess Natli, and having plumes and a back like a hawk. If these things be done for the deceased, he shall not be turned back at any gate of the underworld. He shall eat and drink and perform the natural functions of his body as he did when he was upon earth. It's incredible, isn't it, when you think about it, that they had no idea about the supernatural or the continuance of the soul and what it would actually mean to be dead in reality. In other words, their death was a physical reality and nothing had changed. So this was a very cynical control system. Of course, and they said, none shall rise up to cry out against him, and he shall be protected from the hands of the enemy forever and ever. This was at the end of the ritual. So it was all about belief and imposed belief by a hierarchy who kept the population under very strict control. Ritual and learning were essential if one were to successfully maneuver through the afterlife. Well, a passage inscribed inside the pyramid of Unas says, the bones and flesh that possess no writings are wretched. But behold, the writing of Unas is under the great seal, and behold, it is not under the little seal. Everyone in Egypt was led to believe that words of power would provide food and drink in the afterlife. They even had words for the animals which may hinder them when they were in the afterlife, especially dangerous crocodiles. Well, most of these incantations, which I've been reading through, are far too long and tediously repetitive to even bother repeating here. I'll give you some quotes though, and this should be quite interesting to anyone who's not heard them or even looked into the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Thou shalt not advance to me, for I live by reason of the words of power which I have with me. I am wholly provided with thy magical words, O Ra. My message to you is in my words of power. I shine from the Sektet boat. I am Horus, the son of Isis, and I have come to see my father, Osiris. I have become a spirit in many forms. I have gained the mastery over my words of power, and it is decreed for me to be a spirit. Well, this was a strict system. Even after death, they were taught to believe they were controlled and must comply with ritual and have food and drink to sustain them in the afterlife, along with, of course, following a very strict rule book, and indeed probably dying in fear of what was in store for them. Well, the sources of this belief system were from Thoth and Isis. Thoth being known as the scribe of the gods, the lord of writing, the master of papyrus, the maker of the palette and the ink jar, the lord of books and the power of speech. Is there anything he couldn't do? It doesn't look like it. Here we see how every autonomous action we might today take for granted is actually in the hands of controllers. Well, they didn't use the term OCD then, but it must have been the norm amongst the citizenry. A culture based on ritual and repetition, living in constant fear and being suspicious of odd events or anything out of the ordinary, as it could be black magic done by an adversary against you. The basis of trust was therefore eroded by these imposed beliefs. Thoth was the lord of divine words. Every action or thought needed his approval. Mental slavery even after death Of course, as it was believed that you had to be promised sustenance from those already living on behalf of the gods who had actually granted the afterlife. Osiris was also dependent on being given words of power by Thoth, and these words had to be pronounced in the proper tone of voice. One could not exist after death without the words of power buried with your dead body. And these would be put into amulets. Scarab beetles which had been blessed would be put in the mummification bandages. The removal of organs, of course, and mummification process of the pharaohs showed not a reverence for life, but a fear of what would happen after death. Thoth was in charge of making you look like you did in death as you were when you were alive. It was all up to him. So if you wanted to keep your good looks, you had to ask Thoth first. Appearances were very important, and that didn't end with the death of the physical body. It was a minefield, even getting into the correct procedure for the afterlife. One could not just pass away and hope for the best. This was a complex game, and you were indoctrinated to play it. The robotic-looking figures in the illustrations and the papyrus that we see today are there to serve their masters, nothing more. So the need to use magical words was essential for both the living and the dead. It was believed the name of a demon or god, when pronounced properly, was bound to answer and do whatever was commanded of them. When the name was known of another person, then this meant that good or evil could be done to them. Nothing different from the later systems of black magic, and nothing new at all. The idea that the name of the person contained their very essence and could be controlled by a magical ritual was prevalent in ancient Egypt. The name was important to them as the soul. Long passages were written directing the dead to destinations and making sure they went unhindered. They were told of the existence of 7 halls in the kingdom of Osiris, which the deceased would be anxious to pass. The gates to each section were guarded by a watcher. To prepare for this, models of the doors and the doorkeepers had to be made, and a specially prepared speech written on papyrus were all essential. Can you imagine how long this took? The thigh, head, heart and hoof of a red bull were offered at each gate, as well as other offerings. All this had to be written down meticulously and remembered. And also, one had to pass through 21 hidden pylons of the house of Osiris in the Elysian fields, and you had to learn a really long speech to get in. I won't bore you with the details, but it is incredibly complicated. I'm going to have a very short break. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back to Windows on the World, and this is fascinating, I think, and very important information, because there is so much that has been absorbed into the present elite system from this pharaonic elite system, which was of course run by a priesthood. Passwords and incantations are what we are talking about here, as of course in the later Freemasonry and Kabbalah. The ritual, of course, and again of Hiram Abiff, and the password of the temple, the degree of Master Mason and beyond, are all rooted in the control system of ancient Egypt. Why are these people so obsessed with something like this? Well, they are obsessed with it because it was a control system, nothing more. And from there it went into the Kabbalah, which controls the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, and those Illuminati lodges, the Martinists, the Ellis Cohen, all using the same black magic template and control system because it worked in ancient Egypt. And of course, this is not about knowledge, it's about controlling knowledge. So you give people just enough knowledge so that they can get to one rung of the ladder. Then, if they want to get to the next rung, they have to give some more of themselves away. They have to take more oaths. They have to become more compliant. They have to become compromised. This is how this whole system works. One had to know all the names of all the gods, even those who may be in disguise. Amun-Ra had many names, and you needed to know them all. And then there would be crocodiles after you in the afterlife too. I've just got something here from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Get thee back, O crocodile, thou son of Set. Let the water that is before you turn into a consuming fire. O thou whom the serpent Ra did put in chains. And this was all to be said over a figure of the god Amun painted on clay, with 4 ram's heads painted on its neck, standing on a figure of a crocodile with dog-headed apes to the right and left of it. So do remember that. It's very, very important. Well, having read through pages and pages of this, you soon realise it must have made life a living hell trying to learn all the correct incantations and magic words. Well, all that, and still keeping in with the gods, and then preparing for the afterlife. And of course, immortality, as in the legend of Ra and Isis. Now, because Isis had revivified both her husband and her son by the words of power and talismans which she possessed, mortal man thought it was absolutely necessary for him to secure her favour and protection at any cost, for eternal life and death were in the hands of Isis. As time went on, the Egyptians revered Isis more and more, and as she was the lady of the gods and of heaven, power equal to that possessed by Ra himself was ascribed to her. Indeed, according to a legend which has come down to us and which was written upon papyrus or linen that has been found and is referred to in this book by Wallace Budge called Egyptian Magic, this formed a magic formula against the poison of reptiles of all kinds. Isis made a bold attempt to wrest the power of Ra from them and to make herself mistress of the universe. As usual, no modesty or humility on show whatsoever. The chapter of the divine God, the self-created being who made the heavens and the earth and the winds which give life and the fire and the gods and men and beasts and cattle and reptiles and the fowl of the air and the fish of the sea. Ra is the king of men and of gods, who hath one period of life, and with him periods of 120 years each. But as years where we live, his names are manifold and unknown. The gods even know them not. Now Isis was a woman who possessed words of power. Her heart was wearied with the millions of men. Therefore she chose the millions of the gods, but she esteemed more highly the millions of the spirits. And she meditated in her heart, saying, by means of the sacred name of God, make myself mistress of the earth and become a goddess like unto Ra in heaven and upon the earth. Well, the pharaonic death cult was a perfect crowd control system, making the population slaves to superstition and ritual. The robotic subservience in the one-dimensional figures we see in these diagrams, these pieces of papyrus, indicate a strict form of totalitarian governance and a strict caste system. But who was in control of the pharaohs? A priest class who knew how to manipulate and control the every thought and belief of the masses under their puppet pharaohs. And what we learn from this cult, which actually lasted about 2,500 years officially, is that Egypt was ruled by native pharaohs until the kingdom of Kush conquered it in the late 8th century BC. After that, Egypt was ruled by the Achaemenid Empire and then the Ptolemaic dynasty. Egypt became a Roman province in 30 BC, which ended its independence. Well, when we look at the captivity of those who in modern times were called Jews, we can see that those imposing this strict belief system were a huge influence on their captives. The controllers of the pharaohs knew how to create bio-robots, slaves to the system through fear, in life and of course in death. Masters of control, of course, and that system worked for thousands of years. The emulation of this is still going today, but of course there is an illusion of choice. The Pharisees were under this control also. The need for ritual. Well, we see this in the later Talmud. It shows the obsession with performing repetitive tasks many times a day. The Babylonian Talmud opens with an argument over ritual and what should be done when. It is two rabbis having this insane argument about things that in reality should not really matter. It displays levels of neurosis over minuscule details which are completely unnecessary. It is not simple, but over-complex and incredibly time-consuming. And this, of course, all came from this pharaonic control system, the need for obsessive ritual and compliance, or how to be a functioning bio-robot, the need for obedience. And in the Old Testament, it revealed the ritual of animal sacrifice, the demands of Moses upon his people, and the continuance of ritual and appeasement. The priesthood of Egypt had introduced male circumcision to control the behaviour of their slaves by circumcising at only 8 days of age. So when the baby's on the 8th day, they would circumcise the baby. This would lead to easily triggered bio-robots who could be controlled through their knee-jerk reactions for the rest of their lives. Even used as attack dogs, of course, when necessary. And this is something which those who controlled the pharaohs of ancient Egypt knew all about. They knew how to control people. They knew how to turn people into functioning bio-robots who could be triggered when necessary and shut down when necessary. Along with this, the pharaonic system imposed the details which must be adhered to, the lists of demands which were on the face of it wholly unreasonable, well, especially in a desert. Well, if indeed that was the location of an exodus or the original home of the pharaohs and their cult leaders. So in Egypt, there was no philosophy for the masses out there, only obedience. The builders of the pyramids and the craftsmanship on show was a direct contradiction of the imposed belief system, which was overtly controlling through superstition and ritual. When one looks at the Great Pyramid, it does not compute with the pharaonic system, which did not encourage any individual thought outside the strict rules of its governance. Well, of course, the Great Pyramid was never a tomb. It was just said to be a tomb. The present day, the would-be pharaohs in the present day use this simple analogy to keep their secrets safe. Of course they do. And this is the whole purpose of Freemasonry, a lifelong hamster wheel which just controls the initiate, makes him pay for everything, keeps him in perpetuity to the brotherhood. The levels of knowledge and the long-term projects of pyramid building were from an elite system which was behind it all. It would appear that this system was beyond the ability of the pharaohs. They were front puppets. The priest class behind it all were skilled in management, and the population were under control, divide and rule just through fear of black magic. So when we look at ancient Egypt, it seems that we are seeing a dynastic theatre show exhibited through mummies, ornate sarcophagus and chimera. All of this stuff that we see which they left behind is about the glorification of death and the afterlife. We don't get to see anything which looks like revelation, inspiration, knowledge, wisdom, insight. It is just a controlling cult. Between 3100 BC and 332 BC, Egypt was ruled by 31 different dynasties, which are classified as the Old, Middle and New Kingdoms. The main thing is, of course, that the rituals and the belief systems carried on with some variations right through the whole pharaonic dynastic system. And the hieroglyph system is thought to have originated about 2800 BC. But did it originate in Egypt? There is evidence of a global pictorial language which was used around the world. We actually did a show about this with Stephen Strong from ForgottenOrigin.com, and it's called the First Global Language. And the very interesting thing about this is that hardly anyone is interested in this information at all. They are interested in trivia. They are interested in the ritual of everyday repetition, of maybe watching videos, of maybe listening to their favourite news cycles which go nowhere. So nothing has really changed in the system of mind control. It's just got a lot easier. It's got a lot more dumbed down. You don't have to do as much. You don't have to be thinking about what you're going to be doing in the afterlife. You don't have to prepare. You don't have to get your relatives ready to be bringing your food every day when you're dead. We've gone a little bit further than the pharaonic control system, but not much really. And the same mentality, the same control, the same simple methods are still in use today. It appears, though, that the advancement in knowledge came through the Greeks and, to an extent, the Romans, who controlled the history, and we can't believe pretty much anything that the Romans said about people who came before them. And this, of course, is the problem we have with the early Christianity, because Constantine relocated it in 325 AD. But the early Christian Gnostics and the later New Testament was such a huge change. The elite crowd control system spoke of the mystery schools, initiation into certain levels of knowledge. But when this new belief system of Christianity came along, it was revolutionary. And the idea of Freemasonry is to control the simple knowledge that we all have and give the willing dupes small pieces of information which would never add up to much, but would force compliance through oaths and secrets, which would be used without hesitation against the acolyte if they stepped outside or talked too much, which is exactly what the Pharaohs imposed on the people thousands of years ago. And when we look at the past and the priesthood behind the Pharaohs, the history we are given, it never adds up unless it is looked at objectively as a system of control. The pharaonic system, which the founders of the Grand Orient Scottish Rite or Asiatic Brethren imposed on their cult members through levels of initiation, was still always using fear and coercion to exploit the indoctrinated. Of course, getting the public to police themselves through fear and having to learn rituals has worked very well. It is clear why the Pharisees who followed on from the Pharaohs hated the early Christian movement. It was simply bad for business. If people took responsibility for their own lives and had a contact to the all-governing source or God, then that would be dangerous for the controllers. They would no longer have a role. They would no longer be in control, of course. There was no mystery school and no mystery, just some that knew how to control and those who fell under that control. Be initiated into our priesthood, and we will make sure your lifelong membership will keep you subservient and lead you nowhere outside our control until you die. And even after death, you're still under our control. Well, that is not necessary. And the Lifelong Learning Project, of course, must recognise this. This is the time for the true individual and the true innovator, outside the box or the sarcophagus. Just as Jesus was a revolutionary and went against their system, it is the duty of the truly free and enlightened being to know when and how they are being controlled through manipulation. And that is the message of tonight's show. I hope you enjoyed that. I thought it was such an important subject and I wanted to make it as simple as possible. I have, of course, read you some selected pieces from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and the book I was actually referring to is Egyptian Magic by Wallace Budge, which was published in 1901. So, stay in touch through the website. Do support the show if you can. If you want to contribute and help me to keep things going, you can go to the homepage at Windows on the World, or you can email me at info@windowsontheworld.net if you'd like to join the £5 a month club to keep things going. Well, until the next show, that's it from Windows on the World, and do stay in touch through the website.
In the